They pushed his wife to tears and reactivated the soldier buried deep inside him. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if you believe silence isn't weakness, consider subscribing. It had been 17 years since Mark Callahan last touched a weapon. He didn't miss the noise. He didn't miss the orders. But most of all, he didn't miss what the job turned him into. Now, at 65, he spent his days tending to tomato vines and rose bushes in a quiet Florida suburb where the loudest sound was usually the neighbors' sprinklers misfiring. No one in the neighborhood knew that Mark once led classified counterinsurgency teams deep into jungles most people couldn't point to on a map. They just knew him as the guy with the garden gloves and a weird limp. His wife, Ellen, was the reason he stayed whole, a former nurse, gentle but sharp, who could still tell if he was lying from the way his eyebrow twitched. Their house wasn't big, but it was theirs. Peace wasn't something they found. It was something they built, brick by brick, season by season. Then came the notice, a letter from the Homeowners Association. Violation, unapproved modification of garden perimeter. Fine, $425. Compliance deadline, 5 days. Ellen read it twice, thinking it must have been meant for someone else. The modification? A wooden bench she'd painted and placed near the tree where she and Mark drank coffee every morning. Mark, it's just a bench, she said, a smile tugging at her voice. I'll go talk to them tomorrow. He nodded, eyes unreadable, but when she returned the next afternoon, her smile was gone. She stood in the doorway, holding a manila envelope, cheeks flushed from more than the heat. They laughed, Mark. One of them said I shouldn't pretend to be above the rules just because I was married to a veteran, and then they increased the fine. He didn't speak, just stared at the envelope in her hands, and one of them took a photo of me, laughing. I told them to delete it. He said, "Make me." That night, Mark didn't tend to the roses. He went into the garage, unlocked a small case that hadn't been touched in nearly 2 decades. Inside, a folded American flag, a pair of black gloves, and a worn patch that read, SecNav approved, retired OPS. He ran his fingers over the stitching. No emotion, just muscle memory. The next morning, he wasn't wearing garden gloves. He wore boots, and the HOA enforcers were about to learn that there's a limit to how far you can push a man who's given everything, and had it taken from him. Mark didn't wake Ellen the next morning. He just left a note. Out for a walk, love you, M. But he wasn't walking, he was observing. From the shade of a jacaranda tree across the street, Mark studied the HOA building like it was a forward operating base. The layout was simple, stucco exterior, 3 rooms, 1 security camera above the entrance, poorly angled. The flag outside was faded, flapping weakly. No one noticed the man leaning against the tree with sunglasses and a thermos. At 8:03 a.m., a black Dodge Charger pulled up. Rick Dalton, HOA vice chair, polo shirt, smug gait, and the kind of man who thought rules were weapons to be used, not followed. He held a Starbucks cup in one hand and a file folder in the other. Mark noted everything. Wristwatch brand, limp. On the left foot, keys clipped on a carabiner. 2 hours later, the second arrived. Tanya Whitaker, HOA enforcement lead, high ponytail, phone glued to her ear, laugh like a blade. She was the one Ellen had spoken to. Mark had memorized their faces. By 11, the building was full. Mark walked away. Not because he was done, but because he knew exactly when to act and when to prepare. He spent the rest of the day in the garage. Tools on one side, memories on the other. He pulled out a metal box, dusty, locked. Inside were old IDs, patches, field manuals, and a leather-bound notebook labeled simply, Contingency. He reviewed a list, not of targets, but of thresholds. Violation of dignity. 2. Threat to family. 3. Retaliation, if provoked. They'd already hit all 3. That evening, Ellen sat beside him on the porch. "You didn't say much today," she said gently. "Didn't need to," Mark replied. "I heard everything I needed yesterday." She reached for his hand. "I don't want trouble, Mark." "You won't get trouble," he said. He looked toward the HOA building, now lit by dull security bulbs across the street. "You'll get justice." That night, just after midnight, Mark returned. He wasn't armed. He wasn't loud. He left something at their doorstep, a printed image of Tanya laughing at Ellen. Blown up, with the caption, "You made her cry. Let's see how you smile when someone's watching you." Attached to the image was a copy of the HOA's own bylaws, with every violation they themselves had made, highlighted in red. At the bottom, "You have 48 hours. Clean your mess, or I will." MC. The next morning, Tanya was pale. Rick didn't show up to the HOA office at all, and Ellen, she watered her roses with a quiet calm, unaware that the man beside her had just declared a silent war. The HOA board didn't officially meet that day, but Mark knew better. By mid-morning, he watched from his kitchen window as Tanya pulled up alone in her silver SUV, flanked by 2 younger men, new faces. Clean shirts, clean shoes, the kind of guys who call themselves security consultants, but never served a day in uniform. Mark memorized their walk. Left foot lead, elbows tucked, one carried a radio with the clip facing outward. A rookie. Detail. Rent-a-cops with inflated egos. Ellen glanced up from the newspaper. "They're hiring muscle now?" she said, half joking. Mark sipped his coffee. "They think intimidation is protection, but they've never met real danger." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have to. By noon, Mark was on the move again. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't need to. He carried precision. At the town's public records office, he accessed documents the HOA hoped no one would ever bother reading. Budgets, permits, expense logs, all public, all sloppily maintained. He found entries for security expenses with no receipts, landscaping contracts to companies that didn't exist, renovation, fees billed for work never completed. He took photos of everything. Then he visited the town's fire marshal. Not as Mark Callahan, concerned resident, but as Commander Callahan, retired Navy, requesting a walkthrough of potential fire hazards in a community building known for its poor electrical maintenance. No one questioned him. By sunset, the HOA office had received 2 official notices, one from the fire marshal scheduling an unannounced inspection, one from the township clerk requesting verification of budget allocations. Mark left no fingerprints, just pressure. But that night, the pushback arrived. A knock at their door, 10:18 p.m. Ellen froze. Mark opened it slowly. 2 men stood there, the same consultants from earlier, only this time less polite. "You've been snooping, old man," one of them said. "We suggest you stop, real soon." Mark didn't blink. He stepped forward, boots scraping the threshold. "You boys ever worked with SEALs?" he asked calmly. They glanced at each other. "Didn't think so," he said, "because if you had, you'd know never to knock twice." Closed the door, locked it. Behind him, Ellen stood in silence, eyes wide. "They're scared," he said. "That means it's working." In the garage, Mark unzipped a duffel bag he hadn't opened in 20 years. Inside was a single item wrapped in cloth, an old field camcorder. Back in the day, it had captured silent operations no one ever admitted to. Tonight, it would record something else. Justice. Because if they wanted a fight, Mark was done sending warnings. He was about to show them what silence looked like before the storm. Mark never moved quickly. He moved with intention. At exactly 2:03 a.m., he parked 3 blocks from the HOA office. No headlights, no sound. Just like the old days. Approach slow, leave no trace, observe before contact. The building was dark, but not empty. Tanya's SUV was parked behind the lot, engine still warm. And on the south-facing window, a faint blue glow, a laptop screen. Perfect. Mark placed the small field camcorder across the street, tucked behind a bush. Wide lens, night mode. He calibrated the frame and hit record. Then, with gloves on, he walked up the access path, not toward the front door, but the side utility panel. 2 months earlier, he'd watched the maintenance man forget to lock the breaker box, still unlocked. Inside, he pulled one wire loose, the one marked CCTV server. The camera feeds would go dark, not forever, just long enough. He walked to the back door, paused, then slid a folded note under it. The note simply read, "I don't break rules. I expose those who write them to hide behind." By morning, Tanya would find it, and by then, Mark would already be 2 steps ahead. Back at home, Ellen brewed coffee in silence. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't want to know, but she slid a folded envelope across the table. Mail. "Came early," she said. Inside were 5 printed photos, surveillance shots, of Mark at the public records office, the fire station, walking back from the HOA lot. No return address. "Just these," she whispered. He scanned them. "They're watching." "You now," she added. He nodded. "Good, then they'll see what happens next." By noon, Mark uploaded everything he'd found to a public Google Drive link. He printed QR codes and posted them across the neighborhood, on notice boards, mailboxes, even the HOA's own front door. Above each code, 1 sentence. "Want to know where your fees really go?" It spread like fire. Neighbors began asking questions. Someone posted the link on the local Facebook group, then read it. Then the town's homeowner subreddit. Within 24 hours, the link had over 3,000 views. And that night, someone broke into Mark's backyard. The motion sensor lights flared on. A shadow bolted behind the shed. Ellen screamed. Mark ran out, flashlight, drawn, not just to see, but to blind. He caught a glimpse of the intruder, black hoodie, gloves, and something shiny in his hand. Mark didn't chase him. He didn't have to. Because when the man slipped through the back fence, Mark snapped a clear, full-face photo with the motion camera on the gate, and in the corner of the photo, stitched onto the man's shoulder, was a patch, HOA enforcement back inside. Mark zoomed in on the image and smiled. "This isn't about a bench anymore," he whispered. "This is war by a different name." And this time, they brought it to his home. The morning after the break-in, Mark didn't call the police. He called an old friend, Sergeant Will Ortega, retired MP, now a private investigator with a small office 2 towns over. They hadn't spoken in 6 years, but the second Will picked up and heard Mark's voice. He said only one word. "Who?" Mark sent the photo. Will responded 5 minutes later. "Brad Henson, former security contractor. Fired for assault. Works freelance now. Probably hired under the table. Can you get proof?" "I already did." Mark smiled. That afternoon, a plain manila envelope appeared on the desk of the town's council chair. Inside, a printed image of Brad breaking into Mark's property. A copy of Brad's employment termination from a previous firm, a highlight of the HOA's bylaws forbidding unauthorized security operations attached, was a sticky note. "They crossed the line. You decide what side you're on." Meanwhile, Ellen had started noticing the shift. Neighbors waved longer. One woman brought cookies with a thank you card. The quiet vet with the garden gloves had become something else, a symbol. But that made him dangerous to the HOA. At 5:47 p.m., Tanya Whitaker held an emergency board meeting. They drafted a statement, accused Mark of spreading misinformation, illegally surveilling staff, and threatening the safety of the community. They posted it online. Distributed printed flyers. It backfired. Dozens of residents commented under the post. "Mark's the only one who stood up for us." "Where's the money, Tanya? We want an audit." Mark didn't respond. He was already planning. The next step. He drove to the county courthouse, filed a civil injunction, not for himself, but on behalf of Ellen. Claim, harassment, intimidation, emotional distress. He included the surveillance photos, the break-in evidence, and even a psychological evaluation from a VA-certified therapist stating the impact on Ellen's mental health. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" Mark replied. "I was trained to be." That night they came again, not to intimidate, but to silence. Two men, masks on, tools in hand. This time Mark was waiting behind the shed, gloves on. Boots grounded. As the first one reached for the patio door, Mark stepped forward. "No more warnings," he growled. The man turned, too late. Mark grabbed his arm, twisted, dropped him to the ground in one motion. The second ran. Mark didn't. "Chase him." He called Will. 30 minutes later, police showed up, quiet, no lights. One of them nodded at Mark like he'd heard the stories. They took the intruder in cuffs. "What will happen to him?" Ellen asked softly. Mark looked out at the dark street. "That depends," he said, "on how much truth he's willing to tell." And in the silence, Ellen finally exhaled. Because now, it wasn't just about protecting his home. It was about showing them he never stopped being a soldier. He just changed uniforms. The intruder cracked within 24 hours. Under questioning, he admitted to being paid $2,000 in cash by a private client connected to the HOA. Said it was just meant to scare him. The client, Rick Dalton. That was all Mark needed. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smirk. He prepared. At dawn, Mark shaved, first time in weeks. He wore his old service shirt, sleeves rolled, ribbons removed, but the fabric still holding weight. Ellen stood in the hallway, watching silently. "You look like him again," she said. Mark turned. "I never stopped being him." She walked over and pinned a small folded American flag pin above his left pocket. "For strength," she whispered. He nodded, then walked out the door. By 9 a.m., the HOA was in session. Emergency meeting. Closed doors. Tanya, Rick, and two other board members sat stiff around the mahogany table. Then the knock came. 3 slow raps. The door opened before they responded. Mark stepped in, calm, firm, folder in hand. "This is a public institution funded by member fees," he said. "I have every right to be here." Rick stood, chest puffed. "You're trespassing." Mark dropped the folder on the table. Photos, contracts, financial discrepancies, screenshots of threatening texts, the break-in arrest report, and one final page, a petition for full board resignation, signed by 86 residents. Rick's hand trembled. You orchestrated this?" Mark looked him in the eye. "No, you did. I just exposed it." Then he turned to Tanya. "You humiliated my wife. You weaponized rules to control. You crossed the line from authority into abuse. That ends today." Tanya opened her mouth to speak, but Mark cut her off. "You don't scare me," he said, voice low. "I've stood in places where bullets answered questions. This is just paperwork." He left them in silence, and outside, something remarkable waited. Dozens of neighbors stood along the sidewalk, many holding signs. "We stand." With Mark, justice over power. No more tyranny in our town. Someone handed him a small coffee. "For the soldier who never stopped fighting," the woman said. Mark didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. That evening, Ellen found him in the garden, trimming back the rose bushes. "You were gone a while," she said. "Had some pruning to do," he replied. They sat quietly as the sun dipped low. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. Mark watched the horizon. "Not yet," he said. "But the next shot will be mine. Because this war wasn't about fists or weapons, it was about resolve, and his had been forged in fire." The petition went viral. Within 48 hours, over 120 residents signed. Tanya tried to discredit it, called it misinformation. But when a local news outlet picked up the story, the tide turned. The headline, "Veteran takes on corrupt HOA," and "Wins community support." That morning, Mark's phone rang nonstop. Old service buddies, local reporters, even a city councilman asking for a meeting. But Mark wasn't interested in interviews. He had one last mission. At 6:30 p.m., HOA held a mandatory public hearing. It was meant to be routine: budget review, landscaping plans, new mailbox paint, colors. But the crowd filling the community hall wasn't there for shrubs. They were there for justice. Mark arrived early, pressed shirt, clean shave, folder under one arm, dog tags around his neck. He sat in the third row. When Tanya entered, she froze. Rick followed, sunglasses still on despite the setting sun. A small security team stood by the exit. The meeting began, until Mark stood up. "Before you vote," he said, "the community deserves to know who's making the decisions." Tanya rolled her eyes. "Sir, this is not the time." Mark opened the folder and handed copies down the aisle: financial statements, fake contracts, photos, a resignation letter from an HOA treasurer who could no longer support unethical practices. "This is the time," he said louder, "because people died to give us this room, these votes, and this right to challenge authority when it goes wrong." Silence. A voice from the crowd spoke up. "I move to suspend the board." Applause erupted. Rick tried to speak, but Mark raised a hand. "Don't," he said. "You've had your turn." Tanya grabbed the mic. "You think just because you wore a uniform, you know better than us?" Mark walked forward. "My uniform didn't. Teach me power. It taught me service, sacrifice, and how to stand up when no one else will." He paused. "But you taught me something too," Tanya scoffed. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Mark leaned in. "You taught me that even in retirement, the mission never ends." The vote was unanimous. Effective immediately, the entire HOA board was suspended pending audit. A temporary council was installed. Mark refused a leadership role, but agreed to oversee the transition team. As he walked out that night, dozens followed him, not in protest, in gratitude. Back home, Ellen waited on the porch. "Well?" she asked. Mark sat beside her. "It's done." She smiled softly. "No, you're done. It's just beginning for them." They sat in the warm quiet of earned peace. No words, no noise, just the weight of a fight fought the right way, and won. Spring came early that year. The neighborhood felt different now, not because the flowers bloomed faster or the mailboxes gleamed brighter, but because fear had left. And in its place, something rarer had taken root: respect. Mark didn't lead meetings, didn't join committees, but every morning, the same thing happened. Someone walked past his garden fence, nodded in silence, and left something behind. A thank you note, a cup of coffee, a folded flag pin. He never said much back. He just watched. Ellen's roses had never looked better. She hummed while she trimmed, barefoot on the grass. Mark built her a new bench under the jacaranda tree, the same one he once used for shade during his recon days. One afternoon, a boy from down the street wandered up the driveway. "Mr. Callahan?" he asked nervously. Mark looked up from the soil. "My dad said you were like a soldier or something?" Mark chuckled. "Or something." The boy held up a school project about local heroes. "Can I ask you questions?" Mark wiped his hands. "You can ask anything. That's the difference between here and the places I've seen." They talked for an hour. Not about war, but about duty. About why silence is sometimes louder than shouting. And about how strength doesn't always look like fists. It looks like protecting the weak, without needing credit. That night, Ellen found Mark sitting on the porch, boots off. "Eyes on the stars. You miss it?" she asked. He didn't need to ask what it was. The mission? He replied. No. He turned to her, eyes soft. But I miss who I was when I had one. She reached for his hand. You still have one. In the distance, the HOA building had been repainted. A new flag flew out front. The bylaws had been rewritten. The budget made public. Tanya and Rick, gone. No lawsuits, no farewell, just gone. The board had even renamed the community garden Callahan Commons, in honor of the man who reminded them that freedom isn't maintained by meetings, but by moral courage. Mark never attended the dedication ceremony. He just stood behind the tool shed and listened. Weeks later, Ellen came in from the yard holding a small box. What's this? Mark asked. Found it buried under the bench. She smiled. He opened it slowly. Inside, a military pin, weathered by time, and a note. For the one who never stopped standing guard. It wasn't signed, didn't need to be. Mark leaned back in his chair, breeze touching his face, and for the first time in months, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to rest, because the fight was over, and peace, real, hard-earned peace, had finally come home. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If it moved you, share it with someone who still believes in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching.